In this video, we're going to be removing, cleaning, and reinstalling a starter motor in my 2005 Honda Pilot. Now, the first thing you're going to need to do is remove the battery because it is in the way, and you need a 10mm wrench or socket to get the terminals off. I'm doing this because the vehicle is starting poorly. Sometimes it grinds after the vehicle starts, and sometimes it hesitates when you're trying to start the vehicle. Now there is a plastic tray that needs to come out as well, and then finally, once the battery and the tray are out, we're going to remove the actual tray that holds the battery up. So there's a metal tray secured by 4 bolts, and that requires a 12mm socket. I'm using a deep socket to do this. Anything you have will work though, as long as it can get down low enough. And as mentioned, there are 2 on each side. Now when doing this, I don't find it necessary to remove the battery tray completely. All I'm doing is removing the 4 bolts, and because it's actually attached to some cables, I'm going to lift it out of the way. Just like that, and now you can get clean access to the starter motor. And there it is. There are 2 electrical connectors that need to come off. I've removed the first one, and that's the switch terminal. And the one underneath this larger rubber boot is your positive battery terminal. So that's secured by a 12mm nut. So the nut comes off, and then just remove the electrical connector, and it is good to go. Now I'm removing this single bolt that is attached to the mounting bracket there, just so I don't have to peel off the electrical connectors, but this is not necessarily required. You can also just take the wire off and remove the starter with the mounting bracket attached. There are 2 bolts that hold the starter on. There's the upper one, and the lower one's really difficult to see. It's a bit of a reach, but it's not difficult to remove. Now both of these are 17mm nuts. I found it beneficial to have a few socket extensions handy, as it makes the job a lot easier. So there's a close-up of the upper bolt being removed. The upper bolt is much shorter than the lower mounting bolt. So the lower mounting bolt is right there. It is slightly more difficult to get at the lower bolt just because the starter's in the way, but with the right extensions, it's not too bad. And as mentioned, the lower bolt is significantly larger than the upper bolt. Now that those 2 bolts are out, the starter should be able to be pulled straight back and out through the opening where the battery was. And there it is right there. Now for the cleaning, I'm only going to be doing a partial cleaning, focusing on the brushes and commutator, the magnetic coils, the armature, and I do want to inspect the pinion. Now there are 2 bolts. They're rather long, and they secure the top of the case so that it doesn't come off. So I'm also interested in inspecting the pinion. As mentioned, there was grinding after the vehicle started, as though the starter motor was staying engaged for a short period of time. So I want to inspect that to make sure it isn't damaged, and it does actually look pretty good. There are also 2 Phillips head screws that need to be removed to actually remove the brushes, commutator, and the armature from the magnetic coils and casing. Once the Phillips head screws are off, everything can slide out of the casing without too much difficulty. As you can see, there's a lot of brush dust. So everything slid straight back and out, and as you can see, looking at the armature, it is pretty dirty, and the brushes are also fairly dirty. So I'm going to be using an electrical components cleaner and just spraying out all the dust and debris, which is probably from the brushes, out of the housing for the magnetic coils. So this one is fairly dirty, however, it is still cleaner than I expected it to be. I'm now going to focus on the armature to ensure that it's clean. And I am taking some effort to avoid spraying this electrical component cleaner onto the 2 bearings. I found that they are actually in fairly good condition and they appear not to require any sort of additional lubrication, so I'm just going to leave them as they are. Now once the armature is fairly clean, I'm going to focus on the commutator, and it's the commutator that comes into contact with the brushes. Now I also used paper towel and a Scotch-Brite pad on the commutator to clean it up a little bit more. And just to ensure that I'm not introducing any of the dust from the brushes back into the system, I'm just going to clean off the cap and anything else that is going to sort of be inside of the starter motor once I reassemble it. And the last thing I'm going to clean off with the electrical parts cleaner are the brushes and springs to ensure that those are clean and free of any dust. Now one of the harder parts is actually getting the commutator back into the brushes. I'm sure there's a better way to do this, but I found it was doable if you use your thumb to hold down two of the brushes and then sort of use the commutator to push the other two brushes in. But trying to go straight in or just use your hand to push four brushes in at once was very difficult. Now when putting the assembly back into the starter motor casing, obviously you need to make sure that your rubber gasket is in the correct place and installed correctly. And you need to be careful as you put the commutator and armature and brushes back in, because the actual housing, the magnet will pull it in fairly fast. So if you're not ready for that, it could pull things back apart. Once the starter body is back on, you can put the end cap on and secure it using the two Phillips head screws. And as shown, it only goes on one way. And once the two Phillips head screws are reinstalled, you can now reinstall the two long bolts that hold the body together. Now before I take the time to put it back in, I'm going to run a quick bench test. So the black is connected to the body of the starter and the neutral of the battery, and the red wire is connected to the positive and the positive post. I'm just going to use the screwdriver as a jumper to first test the starter motor and now test the solenoid and starter motor. There is the positive 12 volt connected to the B terminal or battery terminal on the starter, and then I'm just jumpering it to the switch terminal. So there you can see where it reinstalls into the side of the engine, and you can see the two bolts where it mounts onto. With the battery removed and the battery tray lifted up, there's plenty of room to get the starter back in. I found it easiest to put the top bolt in first, just hand tight, and then go to the bottom bolt, slide that one in hand tight, and then once that's done, just slowly bring them up to torque spec, just with a regular socket first and then going on to the torque wrench. And again, both of these are 17mm bolts. The starter motor mounting bolts have two different torque specs. The top bolt should be torqued to 33 foot-pounds, while the lower bolt should be torqued to 47 foot-pounds. If you remove the mounting bracket like I did, you're going to have to put that back on as well. All it does is hold one of the electrical wires up. I'm now going to reinstall the battery terminal onto the starter motor. And again, it just goes onto the threaded portion of the starter, and you reinstall the bolt and tighten it down. Once that's complete, there's the rubber grommet that needs to be slid back over top to prevent it from coming in contact with the element. And the last thing to do is to reinstall the S terminal or the switch terminal onto the starter. Once it's securely fastened, just push the rubber boot back over the terminal connector. Now before going to start the engine, obviously there's a few more things to put back together. The first one is the battery tray, again with the 4 bolts. Now that the bolts are installed, I've replaced the little plastic shield and reinserted the battery. Obviously, once again, use the 10mm wrench, or if you're going to use a socket, that's fine, and reinstall the terminals. And now it's time to give it a test run. and great success. Now I'm going to turn it on and off 3 or 4 times here, but of note, and it has been a few days between shooting this video and then doing the audio voiceover, the starter is no longer grinding after the vehicle is started, and it is also no longer hesitating. So previously you'd start it, it would turn over, it would go dead for a second, and then it would start turning over again and eventually start the vehicle. It is now starting perfectly. I believe it was a connection issue with the switch terminal, but I was committed to cleaning the starter, so I did that anyway. Now, a starter replacement at a dealership or at a garage is actually fairly expensive in this vehicle, so this could be an easy way to save a lot of money. Or even if you needed to replace the starter, you can still save a great deal of money by doing this yourself, and I think it could be done easily within an hour to an hour and a half if one were not shooting a video on it. Anyway, thank you for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.